Thank you so much. Oh, the microphone is working. Nice. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here in person. I think every second person I met here was telling the same, that it's so great to see all the Julia developers in person instead of just seeing GitHub handles. I'm from Kyoto University and I'm a mathematician, but at the moment I'm in an institute for human biology, which is great for me because they only care that I make pretty simulations, and that's what this talk is going to be about. And yeah, let's start. So I want to talk today a little bit about agent-based modeling, but slightly from the perspective of which challenges do we have in developmental biology. And that's mostly picture show. And then I have two packages which are relatively small packages. One of them is focusing on making agent-based models on the GPU faster. And the other one is just a very small helper tool I needed and made into a small package. And in the end, I want to give an outlook on things which I'm planning to work on at the next time. And I think I'm very curious about feedback, like advice or seeing connections to other Julia packages and seeing what's already there. So feedback is very welcome. I can actually present the main part very quickly. So the package which I'm going to present is going to actually have only two functions. So the package I'm showing in the end is going to deal with positions x and how we can find neighbors within a cutoff region of from these positions. So it's very straightforward code, and basically my contribution was to make that GPU capable. And yeah, so that's the one slide overview of my talk. Now let's go to the first part about developmental biology. So an introduction to agent-based modeling is really difficult, and some of the experts are sitting here in the audience, not me. So I understand agent-based modeling a little bit as you consider a lot of agents. They can be pedestrian cells or anything which is somehow an individual unit. And then you want to figure out how do they behave together based on the interaction laws. So here, this is some simulations for mesenchymal cells where we thought, okay, cells somehow they link to each other, and then depending on that, they maybe change their polarity, so the direction in which they walk. And in this kind of simulation here, the cells somehow collectively move from the left to the right, even though the interaction laws are completely symmetric in a certain sense. And such behavior can be studied with agent-based models. And I don't like agent-based models actually, because I think they're more like a last resort. So usually you would like to use a nice physical model if you can, but often especially in biology, things get messy and complex, and agent-based models are like one resort to deal with such complexity. Maybe not everyone knows what developmental biology is about, so I will give also one slide introduction to that. In developmental biology, we are interested basically how a chicken turns into an egg. And that is a process with a lot of intermediate stages. So first you have one cell, it turns into a few cells. At some point they figure out what is up and down, and then they figure out what is my spine and all of these things. And they are very complex cellular processes underneath. And it's quite clear that capturing each of these stages is borderline impossible with like nice physics model, because there's genetics going on, there's like interaction between like phenotypes of cells are changing, and there's the mechanics between cells. And we cannot just put all of that into a model and hope that it works. We somehow have to make assumptions. And in agent-based modeling, we can, for example, focus on part of these stages and then say, oh, we think it works like this. Does it work in the computer? Okay. Let's hope that we survive. So now I have a few videos, and these are basically all Julia simulations which I did in the last 4 years. So the first project was on something called epithelial to mesenchymal transitions. That is basically like the abstract term for example, skin cells turning into cancer cells. And that was the start of my PhD, like 4 or 5 years ago, where I rewrote Fortran MATLAB solution into Julia. And that was a really good decision, as a lot of you would probably also agree. It saved me a lot of mental pain, and in particular, everything became a lot faster because you don't have to translate your Fortran simulation into some files in between and load them in MATLAB and all of these things. So I was really happy of going into Julia, and basically the pandemic was for me a time where I spent 50% of my time online checking the Julia forum, which was also a good time. So this is, for example, one of the simulations I was working on for an epithelial tissue. So that is something like skin. Here the visualization is with ParaView because it's quite old. Nowadays, of course, you can use Maki. But translating this just worked out well. And here I want to talk a little bit about, okay, what are the challenges from biology? In biology, one of the challenges we faced in this problem is that usually you have a model and you want to find parameters. So that's kind of like, there are a lot of talks here about finding parameters, but here in this particular challenge, the biologist was like, oh, actually I have 5 parameters, and for these 5 parameters I want to try all combinations. And why do I want to try all combinations? Because the biological cells just are like this. So cancer cells are so difficult to treat because they're heterogeneous. If you have 2 cancer cells, the chances that they are very different are quite high, and that makes it so difficult to treat them. And that makes experiments also challenging. So in this particular project, the challenge was that we want to explore all the parameter sets and not just applying like parameter optimization techniques or something. So, and that requires speed. So here a few numbers, basically the previous solution. In the end, we needed to run 150,000 simulations more or less to get good statistics, and then you can see how basically transitioning to Julia made that feasible. And that is basically my PhD in a nutshell. Here the lessons learned a little bit is that, of course, Fortran is fast, but Fortran is not fast if you write in every time step a CSV file. And there Julia can very easily save already quite some performance by just keeping it in the memory. And then plotting with GLMarky is fast, which most of you probably know. And then in the end, I introduced some new numerical method, which I found from some NVIDIA researchers, and that really pushed the simulations also further. Let's see at the time. Okay. So yeah, and then basically we used this kind of model and explored all the parameters. In the end, also talked with the biologists who could kind of replicate one of the findings from the simulations, which was really nice. And I think it was, in this case, only possible because of Julia, in the sense that we really could run all of these simulations. So this recently also got accepted. That's the end, basically, of my biology talk here. I don't know how interested it is for you, because probably we all have very different backgrounds. But just to show a little bit where Julia is used nowadays. Here a few more slideshows. Basically, I also use Julia simulations for lymph morphogenesis. So in the center you have our model, and on the side you have the experimental data, which kind of matches in a nice sense. That's what I'm currently working on. And here, of course, like we all know that we can also use the ordinary differential equations package and match it nicely with some agent-based simulations. And then here are some more videos of agent-based models programmed with Julia. With Michelle and Claudia and Sarah and Seren Lee. So this is basically what I'm doing, and now I want to show you one of the tools I developed for that. One lesson I learned, and okay, the authors of Agents JL is here in the audience, so I shouldn't say this, but one thing is that already plain Julia is kind of doing a good job for my task for agent-based modeling, because somehow you can develop very quickly your code, and Julia has all the tools you need, in a sense, to make very flexible simulations. And what I also learned in all of this is writing the simulation is one part, and analyzing this is where 90% of the time goes into. So here the develop ecosystem really helped in the last time. Okay, now to something new. I now want to show an implementation, or like how to quickly implement a very simple agent-based model, and one could say this is actually a particle model. So this is a model where we just consider a lot of spheres, and the spheres want to go to the center, and they don't want to overlap with each other. So one of the challenges for agent-based models is when you have concrete things, they don't want to overlap. And we can model this, for example, with some kind of force which activates when things are getting too close to each other. So you could input that basically as a differential equation and just apply some solver. The main effort is basically to compute the sum. For each agent, for each I, you need to compute the sum over j. And of course, you want to do that quick. And that's very well known how to deal with that challenge. The video here doesn't show so well probably on the screen, but basically there's like 100 cells simulated on the GPU. And it needs like a few seconds to run. So, and this is possible because of the cell list method. The idea of the cell list method is very simple. You have your positions and you want to know what are the particles which are close by to each other. And what you do in this case is that you draw a circle around your particles with the radius where you're interested in. And then you only iterate over particles which are in these boxes around your position. So basically your task is have a lot of positions, put them into boxes, store the boxes somehow, and then be able to iterate over them quickly. And the code of using this with the package I developed is also pretty straightforward. So essentially if you want to use the package, all you need to do is you provide a vector of static vectors. For the positions, you provide a cutoff, and then you can construct such a hash grid. I will explain in a second. With the cutoff, you tell how many boxes do you want to have in total. That is like one of the parameters determining how quick the method is. And then when you want to iterate over the I and j's, you basically in the inner for loop, you can say, I only want to iterate over the neighbors within a certain cutoff radius. And this maybe gives you a few particles too much, so you should check the distance as well. This case, so this is how the package is used, and that's very similar to the more established package called cell list maps. So in comparison to cell list maps, some the features which I'm providing is that you can have unbounded domains, so you can have your points anywhere in space, and you don't need to say, oh, I'm in this area. And all of this is allocation free, what we see here. And I opted for a very minimal interface, so whenever you have some kind of applications where you need to quickly iterate over your neighbors, I think you can use this framework quite well. So spatial hashing is, for example, also used for collision detection or in rendering applications. So there are different setups where you maybe want to iterate over neighbors. So quickly about, okay, what exactly is the spatial hash? Why is it called hash? So the idea is, what is a very canonical idea is that the boxes, how do we store them? Let's say we want to store 6 boxes. Here in this example, then we could say, okay, we take a position, we convert it to a lattice position. So we just look into in which box am I at the moment. And then we say, okay, all the cells which are in the box number 1, I store in one list. And all the cells which are in box number 2, I store in another list. And you could periodically continue that. And that would be one approach. But for this approach, basically your lists would be distributed in a box. And sometimes when your particles are only in one area, that's not the best choice. This is where the hash comes into play. So instead of enumerating your boxes periodically with this kind of grid-like structure, you can also apply some random hash function. So meaning that here in the boxes get kind of like random numbers, and they're also not periodic, and then each particle which is in a box with a number 1, I store it in the same list. Each particle box number 2, I store it in the same list. And that's kind of a very nice approach to like have very fine control over how many lists do I want to have, and without determining how your domain exactly looks like. And here are the references for this. So it's used, for example, by NVIDIA Warp and other NVIDIA packages. So yeah, and okay, you can read this on the documentation, but basically you now have these two functions for the hash grid and the bounded grid. And one detail now is that if we want to use the GPU, we need to tell what data structure we want to use. And in the constructors, there's a fourth argument where you can tell I want to use a CUDA array with int 32s, for example. And that becomes important if we want to use the code on the GPU, because that should be a data type suitable for your platform. That can also be a metal array, or that could also be any kind of abstract vector. And yeah, and don't forget sometimes to update the cells. So when your positions change, then you should update the grid accordingly. That's what the update function does. And now I want to show how to integrate that with on a GPU or possible other backends for kernel abstractions. So kernel abstractions is a really nice Julia package for developing platform agnostic code, parallel code. So you can target the CPU, you can target Intel 1, you can target M1, you can target NVIDIA, CUDA, and all these different platforms. So here I have the example with CUDA because my laptop has an NVIDIA GPU. So first you need to, in this case here we define the backend as the CUDA backend, and we need to decide what floating point numbers we want to use, so floating point 32. And then there is the package called adapt, which allows you to shift arrays onto the suitable format for a platform. So here, for example, we use adapt to shift the position array onto the GPU. And then finally, when we now construct a hash grid, the only thing we need to take care of is that we are inputting float 32s, and we input a CUDA array, and we use a CUDA array for the indices. And then writing a kernel in kernel abstractions is relatively straightforward. We just define a function with a kernel in front. And here we now need to take care that everything inside that function is basically static. And that is not really a problem. So the code is quite canonical. We have the index, we access our positions. And then we have the inner for loop over j, where we iterate over the neighbors. And in some sense, you don't have to do much. And calling it is similarly simple. You just need to decide your backend, number of threads, and the length of your input arrays. And that's all. I would say the implementation here is quite canonical. It's just a parallel double for loop, and where we replace j over 1 to n with j over neighbors. And that's all. And the syntax allows you also to use it in different contexts. For example, if you want to use threads or some other backend or some other way to parallelize. So in particular, that means that this can also be used in agents.jl. I haven't finished implementing all the examples yet, unfortunately. But yeah, that was the idea of all of this. Okay, so a quick outlook on the alternatives. So there's cell list map, which is very established and sometimes actually faster. I will show benchmarks in a second. And there's nearest neighbors, which uses a different technique for that problem. And both of them don't work on the CPU, but they are both good for their applications. So I love both of these packages. The benchmarks here as follow. If you have uniform, like very dense particles with not many neighbors, then you can see how if we're here comparing basically the CPU serial performance to going to cell list map, we gain, and then using the package I implemented gains a little bit of extra performance, and we see that it doesn't matter if we use the bounded grid or the hash grid, both of them perform equally well. And then finally we can go to the GPU and gain extra performance. So that's basically good news for these applications. Actually, there are applications where the whole picture swaps around. So cell list map was developed with atomic simulations in mind, where you usually have a lot of neighbors. And in these cases, cell list maps is actually faster. So you need to consider what do you care about? Do you have a few neighbors or a lot of neighbors to pick the right package for your application? And what do I want to do next? So there are two big things. Like one is to integrate this into more examples or provide more examples how to use that for the models. So the videos I showed in the beginning, they're not open source at the moment. And then we need more sorting algorithms on GPUs, unfortunately, because at the moment that's also slowing down the implementation because it depends on sorting at some point. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but it's not really a problem. So the package bounded degree graphs is really simple. For agent-based models, you often have dynamic context between your agents. And I was always annoyed if I use the graphs package that I get allocations, and then if I want to hunt down allocations, somehow I never know, do I have allocations just because I'm creating or removing edges? And of course, you can, if you know that there are a limited number of edges at each vertex, then you can just store them in a matrix, edges times how many neighbors do I allow at most. And this package implements this with the same syntax as graphs, so you can just use that type. I don't want to go into details, but basically you can provide metadata on the edges and on the vertices. And otherwise, it's the same syntax as for graphs. So at the moment, it's not implemented on the GPU, but yeah, in benchmarks, I get like a little bit of performance increasement, but it's not like it's just ×2, and sometimes it's also less, to be honest. Okay, that's all about this. So in the end, I wanted to show a bit more mathematical pointers onto where I want to go next, to make more agent-based simulations on GPUs. And for me, one of the big questions is about contact mechanics, because agents pushing each other away leads to like very stiff problems, and that means you need somehow small time steps and all of these things which are coming with that. And don't worry about the mathematical formulas too much. I don't have the time to explain all of this, but there's a very nice theoretical series that instead of pushing your other agents away with some soft forces, you can actually make these forces super, super stiff, like infinitely stiff, and then simulate so-called non-smooth dynamical systems. And I have here some simulations where it shows this position-based dynamic method, which is really good for non-smooth systems, versus the penalty method. And the nice thing here is that the penalty method suffers from a lot of these issues, like let me make delta t larger. If we take a too large delta t, we have stiffness issues between our particles, and then usually the remedy would be to make delta t smaller, let's say. But that takes, of course, more computational effort. And if I go into the regime where the penalty approach really doesn't work, using the same delta t with this position-based dynamics method just works really nicely. And I think that's a nice method for a lot of agent-based models with things which should not overlap. And let me just show. So this method is not developed by me, but it was developed by NVIDIA researchers for all kinds of really cool simulations, like these simulations where we mathematicians are always jealous. And recently it was actually also applied for like elasticity equations by Anka Chen, called the vertex block descent method. And I think these methods would be really cool to have in Julia. So, and I think in the interest of time, I will skip a little bit over the mathematics here, but if you go to Gauss-Seidel, if you know the Gauss-Seidel method, it's nothing else than the Gauss-Seidel method. And you can do more mathematics, but I tried to implement differential inclusion, so this framework as a package, but it's not so cool. I proved convergence for this method, so if you care about mathematical rigor, you can use it for agent-based models. And I also implemented like position-based dynamics for nice examples, like called learn GPU particles. And I would be really interested in using this method more in Julia and for particle simulations, the really big problem is that you need graph coloring to apply it on the GPU. Because to apply the Gauss-Seidel method, you need somehow independent particles for which you can compute independently. So at the moment, what I would really like to do next is to implement a really fast graph coloring on GPUs, and I heard some people also working on that. And I think that would further speed up these kind of particle simulations. Okay, so with that, I would like to stop, and thank you all for your attention.
Do you hear me properly? Yes, good.
Yes.
I have one brief comment, one question. But first, I just wanted to share my excitement. This is really nice and maybe useful for me particularly, so that'll be clear in the question. Comment just briefly. Sometimes you said agent-based models are where you go when you give up on doing a physics model. But of course, in some cases, and here I am biased, maybe they are appropriate exactly because you are modeling agents, like people or animals.
Yeah.
And my background is cognitive science, and we try to make models of single agents that are maybe cognitively or theoretically reasonable or probable. And we're developing software for doing cognitive modeling. So you take one agent and you put it in an experimental room and you fit the model to behavior to kind of check whether it's a good model of a single agent. And this is the question then. I was wondering how easy, or like, how customizable the agents.jl package is. Can I kind of come with my own functions from my own package that kind of define these various models and just plug them in? And would that also allow me then to simulate many of them in a space, which sometimes you do? Like, is that kind of modular?
I don't want to develop a package for agents. There is already a package for agents in Julia, and like, of course, everyone who works on this is like, I want to make my own package, but it doesn't make sense.
But it integrates with agents.jl, right?
You can just use it with agents.jl inside the for loop when you compute your update. So there's nothing, it's just a normal Julia function in a sense.
Yeah, so as long as you have a function that decides how one agent moves, giving its environments, it is plug and play with your package.
Yeah.
That's really nice to hear. Okay, thank you.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the great talk. I wanted to ask, so you had mentioned that you did these agent-based simulations on the GPU, and one of the considerations was the grid-based position-based search, basically. And so, when you did this on the GPU, basically, is my question. What all other considerations were there in getting this to work efficiently? And for example, does the entire thing run on the GPU, or do you sort of use the GPU for one step and then pull it back to the CPU, then GPU?
So not all the simulations I showed are on the GPU. I should make that more clear. So some of them are also just used on the CPU, and I actually struggle to find the right balance, because somehow the general wisdom is that you should sometimes do collision detection on the CPU in some settings and sometimes not. So I'm trying to learn the right balance. At the moment, my focus was just get everything done on the GPU and then see which part should actually be on the GPU or not. And
great, thanks.
Yeah.
Right. Coincidentally, the way we search for nearest neighbors in agents.jl is with a crude hash that you saw, crude cell list map. So you could actually do much better. You could actually replace our code with your much better code, perhaps internally, because we do exactly the same thing.
I didn't know that,
clearly
actually.
not as well. But that's exactly also what we do. We have this nice cell. So
cool.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I would be happy. It's just 120 lines or something, so. Okay, thank you everyone.